Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Robert Keene, Vice President of the Board of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone today to our latest in our series of public lectures on early Maryland Jewish life, offered in conjunction with our special exhibit, The Amazing Mendes Cone. In the vault of this building is a document from 1818. Each new archivist or collections manager in the last 20 years has been advised that in case of fire, God forbid, if there was only one thing that they could save, this document is what they should reach for. Its yellowing pages don't look like a treasure, but its content, the proceedings over the debate over the Maryland Jew Bill, makes it arguably the most valuable artifact that the Jewish Museum owns. Today, Dr. Medoff will share with us the story behind this extraordinary chapter in Jewish political history and its consequences for religious liberty. But before I introduce Dr. Medoff, I wanted to share a couple of highlights about upcoming programs in March. And yes, March, spring is almost here. Nice weather today. March is a month of community focus for the Jewish Museum of Maryland. On March 1st, we will be hosting a reception for a special photography exhibit. In 2014, CHAI, the Comprehensive Housing Assistance Unit of the Associated, brought together middle school girls from the Jewish, Orthodox, and African American communities to photograph their Northwest Baltimore neighborhood. Their photographs are quite amazing for such young women, and we think you'll enjoy meeting some of them at the reception, and I believe these are the photographs that are up on the walls already. On Thursday evening, March 12th at 7 p.m., we'll again be celebrating middle school students. This time, it's a group from Beth Tefillah who have been working with the Jewish Museum and the Bet Hatfutzot Museum, which I believe is a diaspora museum in Tel Aviv, on an exciting and creative education program called My Family Story. In this inspiring program, students work with museum staff to investigate their family roots and discover deeper connections to larger issues of American Jewish history, community, Jewish identity, and Israel. Their exploration culminates in an artistic expression that creatively represents their family's history, which will be on display from March 10th to March 15th. Finally, on Thursday night, March 19th at 6 p.m., we will advance from middle school to middle matzah. It's the Matzah Madness edition of Late Night on Lloyd Street. Join us and Rabbi Levi Druck of Chabad Downtown as you have a chance to make your own matzah and sample a variety of mevushal wines from Canton Crossing Wine and Spirits. There's much more in the weeks ahead, so let me speak from the heart. Even if I weren't here to introduce the speaker today, I'd be here in the audience. Jewish Museum of Maryland has put together an outstanding series of lectures and events this spring, and I am a member of the museum not only because I enjoy getting this rich menu for free, but also because I support the mission of connecting Jewish people with their roots and connecting our neighbors to the Jewish experience. If you feel the same way, I invite you to join me. If you go up to the front desk at the end of this program, they will take your membership, and as a special bonus, they'll refund today's admission fees. It's a great deal. So let me turn from pitching to politics and offer an introduction to today's speaker. Dr. Rafael Medoff is the founding director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies based in Washington, D.C. The Institute focuses on issues related to America's response to Holocaust. He received his PhD from Yeshiva University in 1991. He's taught Jewish history both at Ohio State University and at Purchase College of the State University of New York. He's been closely associated with the American Jewish Historical Society since 1995, including 5 years as associate editor. He has also served on the editorial boards of Southern Jewish History, Shofar, and Menorah Review. Dr. Medoff is the author or editor of 11 books about American Jewish history, Zionism, and the Holocaust. Just to mention a few: The Deafening Silence, American Jewish Leaders and the Holocaust; Zionism and the Arabs, and an American Jewish Dilemma, 1898 to 1948, and Militant Zionism in America, The Rise and Impact of the Jabotinsky Movement in the United States, 1926 to 1948. He also co-authored the Historical Dictionary of Zionism with Professor Chaim Waxman, published in 2008. And in connection with today's presentation, I would also mention his textbook, Jewish Americans and Political Participation, a Reference Handbook, published in 2002, and named an Outstanding Academic Title of 2002 by the American Library Association's Choice magazine. Nor are Dr. Medoff's contributions limited to books. In 2010, Medoff and comics creator Neil Adams teamed with Disney Educational Productions to produce They Spoke Out, American Voices Against the Holocaust, an online educational motion comic series that tells stories of Americans who protested Nazis or helped rescue Jews during the Holocaust. Medoff has also served as a consultant to a number of television and movie projects. Please join me in giving a warm JMM welcome to Dr. Rafael Medoff.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Caroline, for all your help. And thank you, everyone, for braving the weather, the elements, to be here today. There was an interesting item in the press not long ago, it was just in December, about a group, an organization of atheists who are trying to convince Maryland legislators to remove a provision from our state constitution which prohibits people who don't believe in God from holding public office. There are, not surprisingly, there are a certain number of, let's call them obsolete provisions in various state constitutions, things which are there on the books but are not enforced. This is one of them. But nonetheless, this group has taken offense, and that the quote from the head of the group is called the Openly Secular Coalition. They're based in Ohio. And here's what the spokesman for the group said in explaining why they want the Maryland Constitution changed. He said, if it was on the books that Jews couldn't hold public office, or that African Americans or women couldn't vote, that would be a no-brainer. You would have politicians falling all over themselves to try to get it repealed, which I'm sure is true in 2015. But what we're going to be discussing today is an episode from the early 1800s when legislators were not, in fact, falling all over themselves to repeal a provision in the Constitution that did discriminate against Jews, and incidentally would have discriminated against atheists as well, as we'll see. And in fact, there was a spirited and important debate at the time as to whether or not the Constitution, the state Constitution, should be changed. By the way, there are people, though, in the legislature today who do not think that this provision should be changed. First of all, in order to change it, it's going to take forever, because in Maryland, you only get to vote once every 20 years on whether or not there should be a constitutional convention. And the next one is due in the year 2030. So in 2030, if Marylanders vote for that there should be a convention, then at that convention they should have a change. Okay, so it's not happening so fast. And there are actually some opponents. I'm going to guess that the opposition will probably melt away if we ever get closer to the point. But here, for example, is a quote in this article from a Maryland state senator who says he doesn't like the idea of taking off the books, not because he thinks there should be discrimination against non-Christians, but he says, I think that what they want, that is the atheist activists, what they want is an affirmation that the people of the state of Maryland don't care about the Christian faith. And that is a little bit offensive. Okay, so he's taken offense because he thinks that their motives are suspect. We're going to find in our discussion about the Maryland Jew Bill very, very similar arguments, interestingly. So it's not that nothing has changed, a lot has changed. Yet it's curious to see this kind of argument still trotted out. But leaving that aside, the Maryland Jew Bill, it was not officially called the Maryland Jew Bill, but that common nickname, although it sounds a little harsh to our ears, our 21st century ears, it wasn't intended that way. That was just sort of a common, as I say, a nickname, so people knew what bill you were talking about. Today, if you call something the Jew anything, obviously we would be insulted by that, but that's not how it was meant. The background, though, to this Maryland Jew Bill has to do with the entire broader process of how American Jews came to attain full political equality in the United States. The basis for Jews having the same rights as everybody else derived from the three foundational documents of the United States of America. The Declaration of Independence, where general principles were laid out, 1776. And then the Constitution, 1787, 11 years later, and the Northwest Ordinance, which regulated what was going to be done in new areas in the Northwest that would later become states. So these two key, the Northwest Ordinance was also 1787. So it's the Constitution and the Northwest Ordinance, 1787, which ultimately enshrined in American law and practice full equality for Jews. But before we got to that point in 1787, before there was a finalized federal constitution, in the meantime, the original 13 colonies, the first 13 states, had to have their own system of governance, their own state constitutions, and that's where the whole question of one's religious faith and one's right to hold public office came into play. And each of the 13 states, as they enacted state constitutions in 1776 and the years to follow, each of them had a slightly different take, a somewhat different take on exactly who should qualify for political rights. Now, none of the states prohibited Jews, or let's say non-Christians, including Jews, from voting. So we're not here discussing the question of voting. That was accepted, that free white males could all vote. Okay? It wasn't based on religion. But as we'll see now, a number of the original states had references to the need to be a Christian or to affirm one's Christian faith in order to hold public office or certain related opportunities that I'll discuss. And just to give you a few examples, let's start with Virginia. Virginia was actually one of the most enlightened, let's say, of the original 13. In the original Virginia Bill of Rights, and I'll read from it, it says that it's based on the principle all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. So there was no intention of discrimination in the original Virginia Bill of Rights. The problem only was that it was nearly 10 years before the principles in that Bill of Rights finally became a formal part of the Virginia Constitution. So in principle, it was great as of 1776, but it didn't actually have the force of law for nearly a decade. Some of the other original states had explicit provisions that you had to affirm your faith in, we'll see some examples, but in various aspects of Christianity in order to hold office. So for example, Delaware. Delaware was the second of the states to adopt a constitution. And so later in 1776. And so here's from the oath of office that you were required in Delaware. You were required to take in Delaware. I do profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, etc., and to acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. So it's an oath which is not specifically aimed at Jews. This is important to understand. What we're seeing in Delaware, and I'll mention some other examples, their purpose is not to exclude Jews. Most of the original 13 states didn't have any Jewish residents at all. But it was an affirmation of the Christian faith of the overwhelming majority of the residents of the new United States. So, but in affirming their Christian, so it's kind of the Christian spirit of the new country, obviously it had the effect of excluding people who were not Christian. If you were not willing to make that declaration, you could not hold office in Delaware. In Pennsylvania, the declaration included an acknowledgement that something very similar. The scriptures of the Old and New Testament were given by divine inspiration. There's not a specific reference to Jesus or Jesus Christ, but there's a reference to the New Testament. Maryland, by the way, was fourth, proceeding chronologically in terms of the new states adopting constitutions, and we'll return to Maryland in detail soon. But Maryland, like the others, had a similar religious test as a qualification for office. So in Maryland, the oath you had to take, so this is an oath you had to take in order to hold public office. It included, if you wanted to be a lawyer, because that was considered a public office, a juror, you could not serve on a jury, and you could not have a military commission, because that too was something that would put you within that criteria of being an officer of the public. So the Maryland Declaration says that you had to affirm your belief in the Christian religion. It didn't specify which branch of Christianity, and we'll see some of the states did, but that was the basic roadblock for a Jew in Maryland in 1776, except there weren't any Jews in Maryland in 1776. So it didn't have the intent to discriminate. It didn't have any immediate practical impact on anybody because there were no Jews here yet. North Carolina, you had to, also 1776, North Carolina Constitution, you had to affirm the truth of the Protestant religion. So here you had a specific delineation that Catholicism is not, or Unitarianism, or being a Mennonite or a Quaker. None of those other factors, none of those would be considered to be acceptable. In North Carolina, by the way, you had to assert the divine authority either of the Old or New Testament. I'm not sure exactly why you had that option, but in any event. Georgia, same thing, Protestant, you had to be of the Protestant religion. New York was an important early exception. New York was the first, and at that point, 1777, the only one of the original 13 states to include in its constitution a specific provision which said, and I'll read you briefly from it, it guaranteed the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference to all mankind. So New York, where there were some Jews, of course, already at that point, New York, from the start, full equality was guaranteed for all non-Christians. South Carolina, you had to be a Protestant. Massachusetts, you had to say you believe in the Christian religion. New Hampshire had to be a Protestant. In New Hampshire, it wasn't that you had to take an oath saying you're a Protestant. It was worded in the negative. It was, no person shall be capable of being elected a senator who is not of the Protestant religion. So the wording's a little different, but the impact would be the same. But the critical turning point, as I say, came after the Constitution, and the federal Constitution and the Northwest Ordinance were enacted in 1787, because there, the principle of full equality without any Christian affirmation was enshrined. And the Northwest Ordinance, within a couple of years, by 1790, had been extended into the old Southwest, let's call it. So that became the law of the land. But in the meantime, So Maryland, among others, still had on the books a provision which conflicted with what this new federal constitution mandated. So let's talk a little bit about the background for our state. Maryland, as we know, began with the intention of serving as a refuge for Catholics, for mistreated or persecuted Catholics. Then that was the intention of George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, the founder. But within several decades, for various reasons, there was a rise in anti-Catholic sentiment, and ultimately Catholics in Maryland were deprived of their political rights and deprived of the right to vote. And ironically, what was originally intended to be a haven for a religious minority ultimately ended up treating them quite badly. The status of Jews in Maryland at the time was even worse than Catholics, but again, it was only in theory because you didn't have a Jewish community here. You didn't have a Jewish presence. But just to share with you what the law said. Again, it's not a law directed at Jews, but it's a law directed at non-Christians. So there was a law in the books passed in 1723 which stated, if any person within this province denies our Savior Jesus Christ to be the Son of God, or shall deny the Holy Trinity, so it's a blasphemy law. If you deny that, here's what you would be punished with. The first offense, the first time you committed this blasphemy, you would be fined and have your tongue burned. Second offense, fined and have your hand burned. Third offense, capital punishment by burning. So that was a law on the books. We only know of one instance. By this time, there are only a few Jews in the state. And we only know of one instance in which a Jew was prosecuted under the Blasphemy Act. There was a doctor named Jacob Lombroso, but he was acquitted. He was acquitted because he was needed as a doctor. Doctors are rather scarce, so being a Jewish doctor turned out to be very fortuitous, even in 1723. So ye Jewish doctor, as they called him, was found not guilty. But by the time we get to the period where the Maryland Jew Bill comes into play, which is into the late 1700s and in the early 1800s, there were almost no Jews in the state, just a handful. The fellow who first stirred up trouble on this topic, one of the earliest Jewish merchants to settle in Maryland, came to Baltimore, was Solomon Edding. Solomon Edding came from Pennsylvania in 1791, and he had a personal interest in public affairs. He built relationships with some local state government officials. And it was Solomon Edding who in 1797 made the first formal petition to the Maryland State Legislature to abolish the oath, the Christian oath, to hold office. And that was the bill which was commonly referred to as the Jew Bill. It suffered a string of defeats. It was introduced again and again during the early 1800s, starting in 1802, and again it went down in defeat. First time it came up, 1802, it was defeated in the House of Delegates 38-17. 2 years later, supporters tried again, lost again, 39-24. Historians believe that among the reasons that the bill was defeated in its early tries was that in this period, we're talking 1802, 1804, there were restrictions on other people in terms of holding office. For example, even not all Christians could hold office. You had to, among other things, you had to own a certain amount of property, and obviously women couldn't hold office or vote. So, since not all Christians could yet enjoy those benefits of liberty, so perhaps it seemed to some legislators that giving that opportunity to Jews or other non-Christians wasn't yet appropriate. Anyway, after its second defeat in 1804, then there was a kind of a there was a dormant period in which the bill was discussed a lot behind the scenes, but not formally reintroduced. And finally, in 1818, a delegate of Scottish origin named Thomas Kennedy reintroduced it. Now, by 1818, a lot had changed in terms of the Jewish presence in Maryland. You had a Jewish population of about 100. Some of them were influential businessmen. Among the most important was Jacob Cohen, who, together with his brother Mendez Cohen, is described in detail in the very impressive exhibit that I just saw briefly before we began. The Cohen brothers, well, first of all, the fact that Jacob Cohen owned and operated a bank that was highly regarded, widely respected, that counted for something, because a number of people in the state then saw, for example, Jacob Cohen as a useful addition to the Maryland community. And Jacob Cohen and Mendez Cohen both spent a good deal of time personally lobbying for the bill, meeting with legislators and making the case why the Maryland Jew Bill deserved to be passed. And I would add, it was no small matter that Mendez Cohen, Philip Cohen, and others had taken part in the famous defense of Fort McHenry. So military valor counted for a lot. So you had a situation where the Jewish community was starting to emerge as a noticeable force in Maryland politics, and a lobbying campaign which presented arguments in favor of the Maryland Jew Bill to individual legislators. Among the most impressive arguments that these Jewish lobbyists, the Cohen brothers and others, made, is they were able to present endorsements from all three living former presidents. Adams, Jefferson, and Madison all endorsed the bill. And just to quote briefly from former President James Madison's letter of support, he affirmed that the freedom of religious opinions and worshipers equally belongs to every sect. So it was a matter of principle, fairness, equality, in keeping with what the federal Constitution already mandated as the principles of this country. So you had all three former presidents. Nonetheless, the bill went down in defeat again, and by a wide margin, in 1818, 50-24. They reintroduced it in 1819, the following year, lost again, 47-20, not even close. In 1822, though, the bill began to gather more support. Now, when I say the bill, I want to share with you what the actual bill looked like. Let's take a look at the wording, because it's important to the discussion. I'm going to ask everyone to pass these down. So the original version of the bill that proponents were trying to advance was the one at the top of this page, which is called the universal version of the Jew Bill. Now, in this version, there is no reference to Jews. It's the Jew Bill, but there's no Jews. It's a general affirmation that there shouldn't be any religious test. As you see in the third paragraph, no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office. Here they're quoting from the federal Constitution, basically arguing we should be in line with the principles enunciated by the federal government. it does say in the next paragraph, certain citizens of Maryland are deprived of civil rights when you have such an oath. But not a reference to Jews, and therefore it would not have applied only to Jews. So, for example, for the few other non-Christians in the state, if there were a few Muslims, if there were a few atheists, whoever there might be, it was a general principle and applied to everyone. This version gained some steam in the by the time of the 1822 session, and it did initially pass 40 to 33, and also passed in the Senate 8 to 7. But in order to become law, a proposed legislation had to pass in 2 consecutive sessions. And by the time they got to the next session, anti-Semitic opponents, and I'm using the word deliberately, and I'm going to talk in a moment about their specific arguments, but anti-Semitic opponents of the bill had been able to, I would say anti-Semitic and pro-Christian, because you'll see they came from different angles, were able to mobilize enough opposition that they were able to block it on the second time around. They were so vigorous, the opponents were so vigorous in their criticism and their mobilization of the bill, that in the statewide elections of 1823, the Jew bill actually became a major subject of the campaign. It was one of the major campaign issues. And a number of delegates were, historians believe, defeated precisely because they had earlier voted in favor of the bill, or they indicated they would support the bill. One of the most outspoken opponents of the bill, Delegate Benjamin Galloway, referred to his slate of candidates as the Christian ticket, and derided Thomas Kennedy, who I mentioned earlier as the main sponsor of the bill, derided Thomas Kennedy's slate as the Jew ticket, and tried to frame the campaign around this idea. Nonetheless, despite all of this agitation, the bill did finally sneak in. And when I say sneak in, what I mean is this. It was successfully passed on the very last day of the 1824 session, probably because a number of legislators had left early, because it was, gone home, gone on their break early. It passed by one vote, 26-25. Some of those who left early might have been leaving early deliberately in order to avoid having to take a stand on the bill, because they feared it might alienate some supporters. But under those circumstances, it finally did pass in 1824 and then became law in 1826. Now, back to the arguments in favor and against. Let's start with the opponents. Opponents of the original version that we're calling the universal version, specifically raised their complaint that what they said was Turks meaning Muslims, Turks, Jews, and other infidels might be able to take over the state and promote measures, as they put it, to extinguish Christianity. So in the universal version, they saw kind of a broad threat that all sorts of undesirable groups might attain too much power and therefore undo what they saw as the Christian nature of the state. Another argument was that it would attract Jews to the state. It would attract Jewish in-migration, and soon the Jews might take over if you abolish the oath. A delegate LeCompte of Montgomery County argued that Jews were a separate people, as he said, and they would not integrate with other Marylanders, so they couldn't be fully trusted. They wouldn't be fully loyal to the state. This Galloway, who I mentioned earlier, he described the bill as a shameful attack upon the Christian religion. Actually, that reminds me a little bit of the fellow in the article that I read to you at the beginning, who said that today he doesn't want that provision removed because it's offensive to Christianity. So we're going back here almost 200 years, but you have kind of the same overall sentiment. For Galloway, the whole purpose of the bill was somehow an attack on Christian religion. Kennedy, the main sponsor, was of course a Christian, although because he was a Scottish American, that alone was enough for some people to raise suspicions that maybe he wasn't exactly one of us. There was anti-Semitic literature distributed against the bill, one of which described Delegate Kennedy as one half Jew and the other half not Christian. Opponents nicknamed the bill Kennedy's Jew baby. For some legislators, it was easier to avoid taking a stand. And just to give you one example, Delegate Ross from Frederick County abstained, and here's how he explained it. He said he was abstaining because some people accused him of being a Scotsman, other people accused him of being a Pennsylvanian, and he was afraid if he voted for the bill, then people would call him a Jew. So politically, for him, it was easier just to abstain. Now, supporters of the bill mustered a whole variety of arguments, but the reason the arguments eventually swayed enough legislators is that they came back with a second version of the bill. So this universal version of the Jew bill at the top of the page, this is the one that got defeated again and again. They came back, Delegate Kennedy realized that they needed to change the bill and to narrow it if it had any chance of success. Having a broad bill, which would enable every Turk and infidel, theoretically, to come in and take over Maryland, that scared people. But if you narrowed it down to just this little group of Jews, who include useful people like the banker Jacob Cohen and these guys who fought at Fort McHenry, then it might be more palatable to legislators. So here now we look at the bottom of this page, which is here called the specific version of the Jew bill. So here the bill is aimed precisely and only at Jews. And you see the beginning of it. The purpose of the bill is to extend to the sect of people professing the Jewish religion the same rights and privileges that are enjoyed by Christians. Now, once it was only a bill affecting a small number of people, then for advocates of the bill, the task was to prove not just that the general principle is worthy, which they argued, but also to try to prove that this particular little group of people are useful and good, and they're so few in number that they won't pose a threat. So in an important sense, it was much easier to argue for the narrow bill. So some examples of their support, of their arguments in favor. Kennedy, Delegate Kennedy, the main sponsor, he invoked general principles. For example, he argued that the golden rule and the underlying message of the Christian Gospels was peace and goodwill to mankind, and treat your neighbors as yourself, and that alone should be a persuasive argument, he hoped. He also used the argument that Jesus and most of the apostles themselves were Jews. He and other supporters quoted from the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. So our national leaders, federal constitution already, the Declaration of Independence followed by the Constitution already enshrined these important principles. Okay. And they argued that that it was wrong and maybe illegal to have a state constitution that conflicted with the federal constitution. But they also mounted a number of arguments based on things about the Jews themselves. These are very Jewish specific claims. Yes, the Jews have some faults, but those are the result of persecution. Stop persecuting them, and they'll be, more or less as good as everybody else. That's one argument. If we want the Jews to embrace Christianity, if we hope that they will convert, Well, persecution, we see from history, makes them stronger and makes them resistant. So let's not mistreat them. Let's treat them nicely. Let's embrace them. Let's welcome them into our community. And maybe that will hasten them eventually accepting Christianity. There was also the argument made that the law itself wasn't effective. Why? Because people who didn't believe in Christianity, let's say atheists or other religions, they could just lie. If they didn't care, about whether or not they were, if they looked at the law mockingly, if they considered it to be absurd, they could lie and just say, yes, I affirm it, and then they're in. And so they could sneak in. And the argument was also made that there were some Jews who might have who took the oath. People who are not known to be Jewish, but they might have taken the oath. We can't read their minds. You can't know if somebody's telling the truth when he takes such an oath. He's just making a promise. But probably the major arguments and the most important arguments had to do with the usefulness, let's call it the usefulness of the Jews. They're bankers, they're merchants, they are bringing business to our state, they're rich, they're sharing their prosperity with other Marylanders. Having them will make our lives better. They'll be a useful addition to the state of Maryland. And that really ultimately was probably the most effective argument. Historians who, in assessing and analyzing the reasons why the bill finally did muster just enough votes to pass, think that this argument, the utility argument, was really the decisive one. When people believed that there was no danger anymore, there was no danger of being swamped by infidels, and there was no danger that the Jews themselves would cause some kind of harm, but rather, look, here they were, linking arms with us at Fort McHenry and establishing banks and doing things that we Christians consider admirable. That made it more possible then to then go along with something which was clearly mandated in the federal Constitution, and certainly to enlighten Christians was clearly part of general principles of Christianity and of kindness to others. So that made it something that people sitting on the fence could finally swallow. Now let's fast forward to 1947.
Dr. Farrell,
Yes.
one question.
Yes.
In the specific version, it says, shall in addition to the oath required to be taken by the constitutions and laws of the United States, make and subscribe to a declaration of his belief in the future state of rewards and punishment.
Yes.
Does that refer to heaven and hell?
Yes, but it's worded in such a vague way that someone who's Jewish could feel comfortable with it. But yes, you did have to sort of, it was a way of acknowledging that there is a divine being, but without specifically having to say divine being. So it's kind of a carefully crafted way of trying to appease both sides. Yeah.
Was Maryland the last state to make this possible?
No, it was not. It was late, but there were a few others that went later. I believe New Hampshire or Vermont was one of them was later. Massachusetts may have been later as well. Yeah, but it took a while. Maryland is the only state where there was this kind of full-fledged public debate. So changes were made in other states because enlightened people came along and pointed out that something was wrong, and then it was addressed and corrected. But this was the only state in which there was a full-fledged public discussion, and it went back and forth, as we've seen for many years, with versions of the bill being defeated repeatedly before this final version was ultimately adopted. Okay, what are we doing in 1947 now, as I alluded to a moment ago? 1947 was a tumultuous time in the American Jewish community because of everything that had happened during the Holocaust years and the state of world Jewry in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So what I mean is, by 1947, first of all, the American Jewish community was completely, fully aware of the enormity and magnitude of the Holocaust. And even those who had had some doubts, by 1947, had seen the footage of the liberated camps, and people understood what had happened. And consequently, the groundswell of support in the Jewish community for establishing the State of Israel became enormous. Because in 1947, you still had hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe, clamoring to go to Palestine. You had the British, the rulers in Palestine, refusing to open the doors to allow them in because of massive and violent Arab opposition to Jewish immigration. You had the Truman administration kind of waffling back and forth at that point as to whether or not to support creating a Jewish state. You have an aroused American Jewish community engaged in nationwide protests and lobbying, trying to get the U.S. government, the Truman administration, to pressure the British to allow the Holocaust survivors to go to Europe. And you had, in this period, a number of very interesting protests and incidents involving American Zionists and British government officials. You had a number of unusual controversies, several of which took place right here in Baltimore. And I want to mention one by way of background, and then I want to talk about one which ties us directly back to our Jew Bill controversy. So by way of background, there was a Broadway play that was created by Zionist activists in 1947 called A Flag is Born. And it was starring, by the way, a young Marlon Brando, just before he became the big star of the movie world. Marlon Brando and Paul Muni was the co-star. And it was a play which dramatized the Jewish right to the land of Israel and highlighted British intransigence and the British refusal to allow Jews to come in and British appeasement of the Arabs. The play opened on Broadway in the fall of 1946. It was a sellout. It was a huge hit. And after running for more than 3 months on Broadway, the sponsors started taking it around to other cities. The British government was furious about the play because the play was reaching a large portion, let's say reaching many Americans in a kind of in a very creative and dramatic way. So it wasn't just a Zionist speech or a Zionist leaflet, but it was a play. It was a stage production that was an interesting and emotional way of bringing home the Jewish cause. British government called it the most virulently anti-British play ever staged in the United States. So they hated it. Okay. They brought Flag is Born to a number of cities around the country, including, originally they intended to play it in Washington, D.C. But the sponsors discovered at the last moment that the theater where it was scheduled to run was a segregated theater. And the author of the playwright, the famous Ben Hecht, was a strong opponent of segregation. And had recently actually been among a group of 33 famous playwrights, including Tennessee Williams and many other major playwrights of the day, had all just recently signed a proclamation they would not allow their plays to run in segregated theaters. So they pulled it out of Washington, D.C. at the last minute. They arranged a special train to go from Washington to Baltimore to bring a group of senators and congressmen who had been planning to see it in Washington. And they arranged to have it play at the old Maryland Theater here in Baltimore. And it was scheduled to play on Lincoln's birthday, February 12, 1947. Only to have the sponsors discover at the last minute that although the Maryland Theater allowed African Americans to attend, they were forced to sit, they were restricted to an area in the balcony. They couldn't have seats with everybody else, but they had to be back out of sight. So at that point, the the Jewish activists who created the play and the local NAACP, the Baltimore chapter of the NAACP, teamed up in an interesting kind of good cop, bad cop routine in which they pleaded with the theater owners to change their policy, but at the same time threatened that if they didn't change the policy, they were going to picket the play. Okay, the NAACP was threatening to picket, while the sponsors were trying to convince them to do it the nice way. And they eventually worked out an arrangement by which the theater was officially leased to Ben Hecht's group for the night, therefore enabling them to have any seating policy they wanted. And that was the first time in Maryland history that African Americans were permitted equal seating in the mainstream theater. The NAACP called it a tradition-shattering precedent, and they were able to use that. They were able to use that episode to force the other theaters in Baltimore to desegregate in the years to follow. So it's kind of interesting, and it's more than a footnote, sort of, but it's an interesting little sideshow about Jews in Maryland using the political, broadly speaking, the political or civic process on behalf here of both Zionism and of racial justice right here in Baltimore. Now, why do I mention all that? Because that helps to explain some of the mood here among the Jewish community here, when just a week later, the following incident took place. On February 20th, the British ambassador to the United States, Lord Inverchapel, had been invited to speak in the Maryland House of Delegates. The report in the Baltimore Sun describes how the police officer on the scene, whose name, interestingly, was Menashe Katz. So we already have Menashe Katz. So already we have Jews who have clearly come a long way from 1826, because he's the police officer in charge of order in the House of Delegates. So the guard Menashe Katz, when he announced the appearance of the British ambassador, 6 Jewish members of the House of Delegates stood up and walked out in protest over England's oppressive policies in Palestine. An interesting and very unusual protest, and one of the Jewish delegates, whose name was Robinson, first name, I apologize, for some reason his first name, Jerome Robinson, explained, "We walked out in a dignified protest over the British policy toward Palestine and their breach of faith with the Jewish people." But interestingly, and I'm going to propose that this is another example of the coming of age of Jews in Maryland politics. There was a division among the Jews. Not all the Jews walked out, because the Jewish state senators, Louis Goldstein and Daniel Ellison, there were 2 of them, they refused to go. They did not want to take part in the protest. So you've got kind of the age-old division in the Jewish community. They can't all agree. Some of them are walking out, some of them are staying put. Menashe Katz is watching all of this probably with a lot of curiosity. The British ambassador, in what I would say is kind of at the risk of stereotyping the British, but kind of like what you would expect, he claimed he didn't even notice the people walking out. Yeah, sure. And I say yeah, sure, why? Because the next day, the British ambassador appeared at Johns Hopkins, and he spoke to a group of students, but, this is the Washington Post reports, he told them in advance he was not willing to take any questions about the Palestine issue. So I've got a feeling he noticed that protest yesterday. He didn't want to talk about the sensitive issue. Not everybody was happy about the Jewish delegates, and what was admittedly, a very dignified protest. They didn't heckle him. They didn't unfurl banners. They simply walked out to make a statement. But nonetheless, the Baltimore Sun the next day had a kind of a stinging editorial criticizing the protesters for their rudeness. They said, granted, there is a lot of emotional tension which has been created among the Jewish people by the Palestine question. This was nevertheless, the editorial continued, an act of premeditated rudeness. Rudeness under any circumstances is bad. Rudeness addressed to a guest is the worst of all. Yeah, I don't think it's the worst of all. I think what the British were doing in Palestine was probably the worst of all. But my broader point, though, is this. If Jews have finally got to the point where you've got the Jewish, the very, very Jewishly named Jewish police guard in the House of Delegates, you've got Jews divided, walking out, protesting, divided both sides, and they're being accused of rudeness. I would say that Jewish disunity and Jewish rudeness are, for better or for worse, part of the coming of age of Jews in Maryland politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, here's what we're going to do. We normally have a 2 o'clock tour which begins at this time, roughly. So I'm going to let those people who wish to go on the 2 o'clock tour without fear of retribution get up and get ready for that tour. For those who would like, there will also be a 3 o'clock tour. For those who would like to stay and ask a few questions, if our guest is willing to join us, Dr.
Delighted.
Medoff, we'll do
Yes.
that. Okay, so give me 1 second so that people who want to take the tour can get up if they wish. And if not, now we'll go to questions. No, this is for the synagogues, right? Okay, I'm sorry.
Just kind of an addition. I'm only 43 years old, so probably the youngest person that's here for several decades, but I was honored to grow up with great But generally speaking, I was honored to grow up with grandparents who are very socially conscious, active in the community. They're all gone, but one of their friends is now 101, was the proponent of citizen lobbies of the Jew bill in the 1980s. Let Sandy and Ricky tell the rest of the story. But I'm not sure if you interviewed Doris, but it's just something maybe give oral history of what she did. I was in high school and college, about a 5-year process.
I was too young.
But anyway, I just thought I would point that out to you.
Thank you.
It's an honor to come. But I volunteer where she is now with other Jewish agencies.
Mhm.
And, she's very keen and proud to tell the story. It's definitely a teachable moment. Were I a child in grade school, tiny kid, I think also. But she stood up for Tom Kennedy 170 years after that awesome event.
Hmm.
So now a group of us as young adults meet her, someone that wants to stick up and stand out for her. So,
Very interesting. Thank you for that.
Sir.
Yeah. Dr. Medoff, you told a fascinating story very well. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. I'm sure we all do. My question is this. At the beginning of the conversation, you talked about the role of the Senate as opposed to the role of the House. You never mentioned the governor. Did that then have no contact to the rest of the story? In other words, did all this happen without the Senate vote, without the governor being involved?
No, there were Senate votes. And they were typically very close. They were like 7 to 5 or 8 to 7. It went back and forth.
One voted 8 to 7.
Right. The final vote that won was 8 to 7. Right. The Senate was a lot smaller. I don't know, frankly, about the governor's position. I'll tell you, in studying this subject.
So there was no veto power.
Right. Governor seems to be completely absent from. So maybe he was not a real factor in the debates.
Sir.
Yeah, in 1830, Baltimore Hebrew congregation was incorporated. What does incorporation have to do with all this other stuff?
I don't think there's any connection. In other words, you could.
No, they did not incorporate as a synagogue until 1830. And it seemed like the Jew bill was what...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So how does these rights that they won because of the Jew bill relate to incorporating a synagogue?
Okay, my sense, without having studied that specific point, my sense is this. There's nothing in the bill that would directly relate to, for example, incorporating a synagogue, and there was nothing in the original oath that would have interfered with incorporating the synagogue. It may well be, though, that the general atmosphere in the state, as a result of the final formal adoption of complete equality, made it more acceptable and more possible. Yes?
I would just
Go ahead.
make a small addition.
Mhm.
In February of 1830, the bill to allow the incorporation of the synagogue gets through committee, and then it is voted on positively, and then a second time it's voted on negatively, and the same people who vote negatively on the bill, some of them publicly say that this is their revenge for having lost the battle on the Jew bill.
Very interesting. Thank
So
you.
there really is, there is that connection.
Mhm.
The governor takes the entire month of, I may be off by 1 month, February or March, to try to get the votes turned around. So the next time it goes through, and that's how the incorporation actually happens. But there is this not literal connection, but there is certainly a kind of public opinion connection where legislators who felt that their will had been thwarted in the passage of the Jew bill tried to block the creation of Baltimore Hebrew.
Has there been any change in this bill over the years that it worked? Because there still is a restriction, but it has weight and reward and punishment. And perhaps some other religions, which I'm not familiar with, would not be able to say that.
Yeah, that might be one of these, what we referred to earlier as one of the obsolete provisions in the Constitution that are sort of still left over but not enforced. You can be sure that if anyone was denied the right to take office because they didn't want to, because they objected to the rewards and punishments, I'm sure there would be a huge uproar. I mean, that would never, obviously that wouldn't stand in terms of, federal law. But there are a lot of constitutions that have strange things. Every once in a while you hear about it in the news. Some state has some really weird and completely inapplicable provision, something that was just left on the books because sometimes it's too much trouble to get it up, to remove it. I mentioned earlier, in Maryland, it's only every 20 years that you even have a chance to say whether there should be a constitutional convention. So there's a built-in bureaucratic obstacle to doing what would make perfect sense in terms of cleaning up constitutions to be consistent with modern sensibilities.
I'm a beneficiary of the Jew bill, along with Ricky Spector. I'm a member of the House of Delegates.
I see.
Ricky's a member of the city council, and her husband was a member of the House of Delegates. So I'm glad to be here today. I'm glad to be in Annapolis. If I may correct you, we can amend a provision, we can take out or amend a provision or add a provision to the Constitution to supermajority, and it then goes to the voters in the following general election, which is one of the reasons why why there won't be a bill that passes taking the atheist provision out of the Constitution, in my judgment, because nobody wants to be on the ballot when that is also on the ballot, because the same kind of sentiment was expressed by that, I assume, unidentified senator.
No, he's identified. It was the Senate Minority Whip, Christopher Schenck.
We've worked with him on occasions.
Mhm.
He's not a Tea Party person. That sentiment would be out there whether it's a presidential election or a general election. So I think that's why the better route is to go to court and have them thrown out by a court.
So you're saying it's not really necessary to go through the whole process of having a constitutional convention?
No.
You can kind of short circuit that,
Right.
in theory.
Well, in theory, if you have the votes.
Yeah.
And it's a supermajority. It's not,
Uh-huh.
the Constitution, it's not 71 in
Mhm.
the House and 24 in the Senate. I think it's 3/5.
Mhm.
It's either 3/5 or 2/3. You can pass a bill that would amend the Constitution if it's approved by the voters in the referendum at the next general election.
I see. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that ultimately what's at play in this political process is simply this. The aggrieved group is so small and not organized that it's not going to happen. In other words, if the atheists were a major lobbying force or represented a major segment of the state's population, then legislators would feel a natural pressure and inclination to do something about it. But you're talking about a group which is not even based in Maryland, and it's an idea, but it's not, it doesn't have any practical, so I assume that's, therefore, there's no push, there's no natural push to do anything about it.
Right, I mean, we've had on the same ballot, there weren't constitutional amendments, marriage equality and the DREAM Act.
Mm-hmm.
So politically, there was the strength to do those bills that went to referendum.
Right.
But there isn't for atheists, plus there is a judicial alternative that would achieve this purpose. One other point,
Yes.
you mentioned that the bill passed on the last night on what we call silent eye.
That's where they all pass.
When people took a walk. Now nowadays, you need to get a constitutional majority for a bill to pass. So there are 71, you need any day. On any day, for a bill to pass, not a constitutional amendment, but for a regular bill to pass, you have to have 71 votes in favor in the House and 24 in the Senate, regardless of how many people are voting, even if there are vacancies.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps there wasn't a requirement for a constitutional majority in those days.
Thank you.
I also recall that the conventional wisdom of not calling for a constitutional convention is because you could put anything on, and that would upset a lot of the apple carts. So that
I
was
see.
why they're loath to do it.
Because in other words, it could sort of create a chaotic situation, or anybody with some particular bug in their head.
With all the craziness that goes on
Right.
in legislative bodies and otherwise, that's why they're loath to do it.
I see. Interesting.
We'll
Thank you.
take one more question if there is one. Sir?
How did the granting of these rights to Jews in Maryland compare to other parts of the world at this time, the way they came early?
Other states or other parts of the world?
Other parts of the world.
Okay, that's not something I've specifically studied. In terms of the other states, Maryland was late, but gradually everybody did it. Maryland was not the last, but it was late among the original states. But I don't know about in other countries.
I might be able to add something here because it was in the exhibit as well. Of course, at the time, we're talking about the 1820s, 1830s, there weren't a lot of nations that had elected office holders. However, among those that did, for example, Great Britain, there was a similar oath problem in Britain. And so in the 1830s, a man by the name of
Benjamin Disraeli?
No. Benjamin Disraeli is converted to Christianity, so he takes the oath and does just fine. It's David Solomon. Now I'm tripping up. But in any case, he's elected sheriff of London, and he refused to take office, even though he's elected, because he'd have to take an oath to the New Testament. Mendes Cone happens to be in England at about this time, because he always happens to be everywhere. And he writes home.
He's like Forrest Gump.
He is like Forrest Gump. He writes home to get some of the arguments that were used in Maryland to repeal the oath. Those go to England. In 1854, Solomon is elected Lord Mayor of London, and the oath is repealed, and he is able to become the first practicing Jewish Lord Mayor of London. So yes, what happened in Maryland had a global impact, not just a local impact.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
I'm Rabbi Jonathan Brown. I made